Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight let us settle down beside the fire and move slowly through the entire lore of Charles Smith, one of the quietest and strongest souls in Red Dead Redemption 2. Charles is not the loudest man in the Van der Linde gang. He does not fill every room with speeches like Dutch, jokes like Sean, cruelty like Micah, or grief like Arthur near the end. Charles often stands a little apart, listening more than he speaks, watching the world with a patience that feels almost older than the camp around him. But the more slowly we look at him, the more powerful his story becomes. He is a hunter, a fighter, a son of two wounded worlds, a man without a stable home, and one of the few people in the gang whose morality does not collapse when the family around him begins to rot. So let the night grow quiet for a while. Let the snow of Coulter fall softly beyond the cabin walls. Let the horses breathe in the dark. Let the trees of Amberino, the plains near Valentine, the swamp air of Lemoyne, the mountain paths near Wapiti, and the half-built boards of Beecher's Hope come forward slowly. Charles Smith's story is not only about what he does in the main events of the gang. It is about what he refuses to become. It is about a man who knows violence very well, but does not worship it. It is about someone who can kill when he must, yet still looks at a slaughtered animal and understands that a line has been crossed. In a gang full of men who talk about freedom, Charles is one of the few who seems to know what freedom should feel like when nobody is watching. Charles Smith was born around 1875, and from the beginning, his life belonged to more than one world. His father was African American, and his mother was Native American. That heritage matters deeply, because Charles does not move through 1899 as a man society can place comfortably into one category. He is mixed, and in the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, that means he carries the weight of multiple histories of violence, displacement, racism, and survival. His father came from a world scarred by slavery and its aftermath. His mother came from a world being crushed by American expansion, military violence, broken promises, and the theft of land. Charles is born from love across two wounded peoples, and that alone gives his silence a kind of depth. His mother was taken by soldiers when Charles was young. That single fact sits under his whole character like a buried stone. It tells us that the violence of the American state is not an abstract political idea to him. It is personal. It entered his childhood and took his mother away. It also explains why he later responds so strongly to the suffering of Rain's Fall, Eagle Flies, and the Wapiti people. Charles does not look at their struggle from a safe distance. He knows something of what military power can do to a family, and what it means when a people are pushed, hunted, and made to live under threats disguised as policy. Charles's father was a loving man in some ways, but after losing Charles's mother, he fell into drinking and became unable to raise his son in a stable way. Charles eventually ran away from home when he was around 13 years old. That means he grew into manhood without a secure family, without protection, and without a clear place to belong. Like Arthur, John, and many others in the gang, Charles is marked by early loss. But the shape of his loss is different. Arthur is taken in and moulded by Dutch. John is taken in and resents the cage of that family. Charles spends years outside any family strong enough to claim him fully. He learns the world as a wanderer. Those wandering years explain much of Charles's competence. He is one of the best hunters in the gang. He can track, move quietly, read land, use a bow, skin animals properly, survive in rough country, and keep his emotions steady in situations that would make other men panic. His skills do not feel like decoration. They feel earned by years of needing to live without much help. Charles is not romantic about hardship. He simply understands it. He knows how to move through the world because for a long time the world did not offer him a soft place to stay. By the time Charles joins the Van der Linde gang, he has only been with them for a few months before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 begin. That is easy to forget because he feels so naturally placed among them. He is not an old member like Arthur, Hosea, Dutch or Susan Grimshaw. He has not grown up inside the gang's mythology. He did not spend decades listening to Dutch's speeches until they became part of his emotional bones. Charles is newer, and that newness matters. He is close enough to help the gang, but far enough to see it more clearly than many of the older members. The Van der Linde gang in its better moments would have been attractive to someone like Charles. Dutch's family includes outcasts, people unwanted by respectable society, people with mixed backgrounds, criminal records, broken families, and nowhere else to go. Dutch speaks against rich men, corrupt power, and the cruelty of civilization. Hosea offers warmth and practical wisdom. Arthur offers strength without too much ceremony. Around the campfire there is food, company, jokes, songs, and the illusion that people rejected by the world can build something kinder on their own terms. Charles can see why that matters. He is not blind to the gang's appeal. But Charles also sees the limits of Dutch's dream. Because he is new, he has not fully surrendered his judgment to Dutch's voice. He respects the gang, and he clearly respects certain people inside it, but he does not need Dutch the way Arthur needs Dutch. This is one of Charles's greatest narrative strengths. He can belong without being swallowed. He can help without being seduced. He can ride with the gang and still keep a private moral centre that Dutch cannot fully colonise. When the story begins in the snow, Charles is immediately useful. In Coulter, everyone is half frozen, hungry and frightened after the Blackwater disaster. Davy Callender is dead or dying. Jenny is gone. Sean is missing. John is lost in the mountains. The gang is not living as glamorous outlaws. They are refugees in a storm. Charles's calm presence matters because survival in Coulter depends on people who know what to do without needing attention. He hunts, he rides, he helps search, he acts. In those early chapters, Charles is not dramatic, but he is essential. The rescue of John Marston in the mountains gives an early example of Charles's reliability. Arthur and Javier ride out through brutal weather to find John, and Charles's role in the larger Coulter survival pattern is part of the same moral field. He is the sort of man one wants nearby when the world turns hostile. He does not panic loudly, he does not turn fear into speeches, he does not enjoy danger for its own sake. He simply enters the danger because someone needs to go. That quality separates Charles from many men in the gang. Micah treats violence as release and entertainment. Bill often turns fear into aggression. Sean turns danger into swagger. Dutch turns danger into theatre. Arthur, for much of his life, turns danger into duty. Charles turns danger into work. That may sound plain, but it is one of the noblest things about him. He does what must be done, then lets the moment pass without trying to make himself the hero of it. In Chapter 2, after the gang reaches Horseshoe Overlook, Charles begins to feel more visible as a quiet companion to Arthur. The camp itself is still capable of warmth there. The mornings are soft, the view is open. People sing, argue, joke, and recover from the mountain. Charles stands among them as someone who could perhaps find a place there, if the gang remained the version of itself that Horseshoe Overlook briefly pretends to be. He is reserved, but not cold. He does not make himself the centre of camp life, but he is not unreachable either. One of the defining early moments for Charles is the hunting trip with Arthur. They track a deer together, and through that simple act the story begins revealing Charles's philosophy. Hunting for Charles is not random killing, it is survival, respect and skill. The animal is not a prop for ego, it is food. It is life taken so other life can continue. Charles teaches by doing, and the trip shows that he understands the land in a way many gang members do not. Arthur is a capable hunter too, but Charles brings a particular quiet reverence to it. This hunting trip also establishes one of the most important friendships in the game. Arthur and Charles do not bond through long confessions at first. They bond through shared competence. They ride, track, kill cleanly, skin the animal, and bring the meat back. Both men are physically strong, practical, and used to silence. Neither needs to fill every moment with talk. That makes their friendship feel grounded. It is not made of grand statements. It is made of mutual recognition. Arthur respects Charles almost immediately because Charles is useful without being foolish. Arthur has little patience for men who talk more than they act, and Charles is the opposite. Charles respects Arthur because beneath Arthur's roughness there is care. Arthur may insult, complain and hide behind sarcasm, but he feeds the camp, protects weaker members and carries burdens without asking to be praised. Charles sees that. Their bond grows because each recognizes in the other a man whose actions reveal more than his words. The bison mission with Charles is one of the clearest windows into his morality. Arthur and Charles discover that hunters have been killing bison wastefully, leaving carcasses behind without using the meat or hides properly. Charles is deeply angered by this. His anger is not sentimental in a shallow way. He is not opposed to killing animals for survival. He is opposed to waste, cruelty, and contempt. The slaughtered bison represent a kind of violence Charles understands too well. Destruction done not from need, but from arrogance. This mission connects Charles' personal values to the larger history of native suffering in America. The mass destruction of bison was tied to the destruction of indigenous life on the plains, because bison were food, material, culture, and survival. Red Dead Redemption 2 does not need Charles to lecture for an hour about this history. His reaction says enough. He sees animals killed and left to rot, and he recognizes not just waste, but a deliberate insult to life. It is one of the moments where his heritage, ethics, and practical knowledge all meet. Arthur's presence in that mission matters too. Arthur is no innocent man, but with Charles beside him he is asked to see violence differently. Arthur kills constantly in the story, yet Charles reminds him that not all killing is the same. A clean hunt for food is one thing, a massacre for sport, money, policy, or hatred is another. This distinction helps Arthur's moral world become more precise. Charles does not redeem Arthur by force. He sharpens Arthur's conscience by standing near it. Charles's use of the bow also reveals something about him. In a gang full of revolvers, rifles, shotguns, and loud violence, Charles often uses a quieter weapon. The bow is practical for hunting and stealth, but it is also symbolic without needing to be forced. It suggests patience, tradition, and control. A gun announces itself. A bow requires closeness, breath, and aim. Charles can use firearms when needed, but the bow suits the way he moves through the world, quietly, deliberately, without wasting motion. Charles is not a pacifist. That is important. Sometimes people mistake gentleness for refusal to fight, but Charles is one of the most dangerous men in the gang. He can kill quickly and effectively. He fights bounty hunters, lawmen, enemies, and later bare-knuckle opponents. He is physically imposing and brave in close danger. His morality is not based on being harmless. It is based on knowing that strength should have purpose. That makes him more impressive than a man who is gentle only because he cannot be violent. The story repeatedly shows Charles as someone who stands close to the vulnerable without needing recognition. He helps Tilly when she is threatened by the Foreman brothers. He assists with camp needs. He works beside Arthur and John. He does not loudly declare himself a protector, but he behaves like one. His decency is not theatrical. In a gang increasingly dominated by men who confuse volume with leadership, Charles's quiet decency becomes a form of resistance. Charles's position in the gang also carries racial tension, though the story often lets it sit in the background rather than making every scene about it. As a mixed black and native man in 1899, Charles would face racism from multiple directions. White society would not welcome him as an equal. Some people would reduce him to stereotypes, threat, or curiosity. Even inside the gang, he may not be fully free from other members' ignorance or prejudice. Yet Charles moves through this with a dignity that does not require constant explanation. He knows the world is unfair. He does not let that unfairness make him careless with others. This is part of why Charles feels so different from Dutch. Dutch talks about oppression and civilization because those ideas are useful to his self-image. Charles has lived them in his body and family. Dutch can turn injustice into a stage for his own speeches. Charles cannot afford that luxury. His understanding is quieter because it is not decorative. He does not need to use suffering as proof of his own greatness. He simply carries it. The contrast becomes sharper as the gang moves from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point. In Lemoyne, the gang enters a region full of old southern violence, plantation memories, racial cruelty, and decaying aristocracy. Charles, as a black and native man, is moving through a place where the land itself seems heavy with histories that would have targeted people like him. The gang's schemes with the Greys and Braithwaites may seem playful or clever for a time, but the setting has a darker charge beneath the con games. Charles's role in these chapters is quieter than Arthur's or Dutch's, but his presence matters because it reminds us the gang is not moving through neutral scenery. Lemoyne is not just a backdrop of old mansions and family feuds. It is a place built on oppression, class, race, and violence dressed as honour. Charles does not need to give a long speech about the Braithwaites for the rot of that world to be felt. His body in that landscape is already a kind of truth. When the gang attacks Braithwaite Manor after Jack is kidnapped, Charles is part of the group that storms the house. It is one of the most cinematic moments in the game. The gang walking through the night, lined up together, anger focused into purpose. Charles belongs naturally in that formation, because Jack's kidnapping crosses a line almost everyone can understand. For Charles, who lost his mother to military violence and knows what it means for families to be torn apart, the rescue of a child carries a deep emotional logic even if he does not say it aloud. The fall of the Braithwaites does not fix anything, though it is a revenge victory, not a true victory. The gang saves Jack, but the violence draws them deeper into danger and pushes them towards St. Denis. Charles is present through this shift as one of the people who can sense, perhaps earlier than most, that the gang's victories are becoming more hollow. They win fights, but they do not become freer. They destroy enemies, but the walls keep closing. At Shady Belle, Charles continues as a steady presence while the gang tries to inhabit a ruined plantation house. Shady Belle is an ugly kind of shelter, beautiful from a distance and rotten underneath. Charles, with his awareness of history and his connection to oppressed peoples, belongs uneasily in such a place. The gang has driven out the Lemoyne raiders, but the house still carries old violence. Charles's silence there feels different from Dutch's speeches. Dutch can occupy the house and talk about plans. Charles seems like the sort of man who would understand that some buildings remember. The Saint Denis bank robbery changes the gang forever, and Charles is not on the boat to Guarma with Arthur, Dutch, Javier, Bill and Micah. This matters because while the shipwrecked men endure a tropical nightmare, Charles remains in the American fallout. He helps protect the survivors who did not flee overseas. When Arthur returns, Charles is part of the broken remnant still trying to hold life together. In a story where many characters fall apart when leadership disappears, Charles keeps functioning. After Guarma, Charles becomes even more important. Hosea is dead. Lenny is dead. Sean is gone. Kieran is gone. Molly is killed. The gang is physically and emotionally shattered. Dutch is becoming more erratic. Arthur is sick, though not everyone fully understands what that means yet. In this environment, Charles's steadiness becomes almost painfully valuable. He is not the leader, but he is one of the few people left who still seems morally awake. One of the strongest examples of Charles's loyalty after Guarma is his help with eagle flies and the Wapiti people. Charles has been spending time with them and understands their situation more deeply than most of the gang. Rains Fall is trying to protect his people through restraint, diplomacy and survival. Eagle Flies is angry, young and tired of seeing his people mistreated. The US Army and industrial interests are pressing hard against them. Dutch sees a chance to use the conflict. Charles sees people. This difference is crucial. Dutch looks at the Wapiti struggle and sees leverage. If he can create chaos between the tribe and the army, he can distract the law, take pressure off the gang, and stage himself as a revolutionary ally. Charles looks at the same situation and sees the danger of exploiting already wounded people. His sympathy is grounded in his own heritage and in his actual relationships. He does not approach the Wapiti as props in Dutch's drama. He approaches them as people whose suffering deserves respect. Charles's friendship with Rains Fall and Eagle Flies shows one of his deepest traits. He is drawn toward communities that are being crushed, but he does not romanticize their pain. He knows Rains Fall's restraint is not cowardice. He knows Eagle Flies' anger is not senseless. He understands that both father and son are responding to impossible pressure in different ways. This is why Charles is such a good moral presence in that chapter. He can hold more than one truth at once. Arthur's connection to Charles deepens during the Wapiti storyline, because Arthur is also beginning to see Dutch more clearly. Charles does not need to convince Arthur with speeches. He simply stands on the side of decency so consistently that Arthur can feel the contrast. When Dutch manipulates Eagle Flies, Charles' discomfort helps confirm what Arthur already fears. Dutch is using people who cannot afford to be used. Charles becomes part of Arthur's moral awakening, not by preaching, but by refusing to stop seeing the human cost. The raid on the oil fields, where Eagle Flies saves Arthur and is fatally wounded, is one of the most tragic intersections of Charles's world and Arthur's. Dutch abandons Arthur in danger. Eagle Flies saves him. Charles is left to deal with the human aftermath of a young man's life, spent in a conflict Dutch worsened. This is where Charles's anger and grief become especially understandable. The Wapiti struggle was already terrible before Dutch arrived, but Dutch's interference helps push it toward catastrophe. Charles's reaction after Eagle Flies' death is not loud in the way Dutch's emotions are loud. It is heavier than that. He knows this loss belongs to a larger pattern of native dispossession and military violence. He also knows the Linde gang helped make it worse. That gives Charles one of the clearest reasons to step away from Dutch's orbit. The gang is no longer a refuge for outcasts. It has become another force that uses outcasts when convenient. Beaver Hollow is the final stage of that moral disgust. The gang is no longer pretending well. The camp is dark, fearful, divided, and physically ugly. Micah's influence grows. Dutch's speeches become thinner and more dangerous. Arthur is dying. John is treated as suspect. Abigail and Jack are unsafe. Suddy is furious. Charles, in this final stretch, does not become louder, but his separation from Dutch's madness becomes clearer. He is still present, still helping, still fighting where necessary, but he is not spiritually trapped there. The mission to rescue Captain Monroe with Arthur shows Charles's moral position perfectly. Monroe is an army officer who tries to help the Wapiti people and is punished for it. Charles and Arthur help him escape. This is not a profitable job. It is not one more score. It does not bring the gang closer to Tahiti. It is simply the right thing to do for a man who tried to act decently inside a corrupt system. Charles understands that. Arthur by then understands it too. That rescue matters because Charles and Arthur are both acting outside Dutch's framework. They are not chasing a grand dream. They are responding to immediate moral need. Help this man. Protect these people. Get someone out if he can still get out. That is the opposite of Dutch's increasingly abstract plans. Dutch talks about freedom while making people less free. Charles practices freedom by helping someone escape a machine that would punish him for conscience. Charles also helps Arthur with the final rescue of Abigail. When Abigail is captured by Milton and the Pinkertons, Dutch refuses to help. That refusal is one of the clearest signs that Dutch's family rhetoric has rotted completely. Arthur and Sadie go after Abigail anyway, and Charles's presence around the final chapters belongs to that same moral current. The people who still understand loyalty as protection, not obedience, begin acting without Dutch. Charles is not present for Arthur's final confrontation on the mountain, but his absence does not reduce his importance. By that point, Arthur has already absorbed much of what Charles represents: clarity, restraint, respect for life, refusal to use the vulnerable, and the strength to act without needing Dutch's approval. Arthur's final choice to help John is not caused by Charles alone, but Charles is part of the moral world that makes that choice visible. After Arthur dies, Charles does something deeply important. He helps bury him. This is one of the most tender facts in Charles Smith's lore. Arthur's body could have been left on the mountain as another outlaw corpse. Instead, Charles and Suddy recover him and give him a grave. That act is not dramatic in the guns blazing sense, but it is sacred in the language of the story. Charles honours the dead properly. In a world where so many bodies are discarded, looted, burned or forgotten, burial becomes love. The location and inscription of Arthur's grave depend on the shape of Arthur's final honour, but Charles' role remains moving. He makes sure Arthur is not simply erased. He treats Arthur as a man who mattered, not as a tool used up by Dutch's dream. This is one of the clearest differences between Charles and Dutch. Dutch leaves Arthur, Charles buries him. One father figure abandons the dying son. One friend returns to honour him. Charles's decision to help bury Susan Grimshaw also shows the same instinct. Grimshaw is not always kind, and her camp discipline can be harsh, but she was part of the family for many years. When she dies in the final collapse, Charles treats her death as worthy of dignity. He does not need every dead person to have been perfect before he honours them. That is a mature kind of loyalty. It recognises that complicated people can still deserve mourning. The years after 1899 are not fully shown, but Charles survives into the epilogue. By 1907 he is in St Denis, fighting for money in brutal underground matches. This is one of the saddest transitions in his life. Charles, who has such a strong moral relationship to violence, is now using his body in prize fights to survive. He is not becoming Micah. He is not enjoying cruelty for its own sake, but he is trapped again in a world that often gives strong men few clean ways to earn money. When John Marston finds Charles in Saint Denis, Charles is battered, tired, and still himself. The setting matters. Saint Denis is modern, crowded, industrial, and full of money-changing hands. Charles is fighting for spectators, reduced in some sense to a body performing violence for entertainment. For a man who values purposeful strength, this is a painful position. It shows that surviving the gang did not deliver him into peace. It only delivered him into another hard arrangement. John's reunion with Charles carries warmth, because Charles represents one of the best parts of the old life. John has spent years trying to become someone else, working under the name Jim Milton, trying to hold Abigail and Jack together, failing and trying again. Seeing Charles brings back the gang, but not the worst of it. Charles is not Dutch's manipulation or Micah's rot. He is memory with dignity. He is proof that something decent did exist in the old family. Charles agrees to help John build Beecher's Hope, and this becomes one of the most important pieces of his late law. Charles, who has spent so much of his life without a permanent home, helps build one for another man. That is quietly beautiful. He cuts wood, raises beams, works with Uncle, supports John, and turns empty land into shelter. The construction of the ranch is not only a practical montage, it is a moral answer to the gang's collapse. The Van der Linde gang claimed to be a family, but it never built a stable home. It moved from camp to camp, always promising future peace while creating present danger. Beecher's Hope is different. It is awkward, flawed, still tied to debt and future tragedy, but it is actual construction. Boards become walls. Labour becomes shelter. John is not robbing one more score to dream about a life somewhere else. He is hammering a life into place. Charles helps make that possible. Charles's role in building the house also reflects his bond with Arthur. Arthur died so John could have a chance to escape the old life. Charles helps turn that chance into something physical. In that sense, Charles becomes one of the hands that carries Arthur's sacrifice into wood and nails. Arthur gives John the road. Charles helps John build the roof. Both acts belong to the same quiet redemption. The epilogue also shows Charles as one of the few people John can trust completely. John is not always easy to help. He is stubborn, ashamed, impulsive, and still drawn toward old violence. But Charles sees the good in his effort. He knows John is trying to become a husband and father in a way the gang never taught him how to be. Charles does not flatter him. He helps him. That is Charles's way of loving people, not with speeches, but with labour beside them. Charles also accompanies John and Sadie to Mount Hagen to confront Micah. This is one of the most morally complicated choices in his life. Charles is not a revenge-addicted man. He understands better than most that violence carries cost. Yet he goes because Micah helped destroy the gang, because Arthur deserves justice in some form, and because John and Sadie are going with or without him. Charles's presence on that mountain gives the revenge mission a measure of seriousness. It is not only bloodlust, it is grief searching for an ending. During the Mount Hagen sequence, Charles is wounded and left behind for a time, but his willingness to be there matters. He is still risking himself for the memory of Arthur and the survival of John. He does not need the Blackwater money. He is not chasing Dutch's dream. He is not trying to become famous. He is there because some debts are emotional, not financial. Arthur gave everything. Charles cannot undo Arthur's death, but he can stand with the people Arthur saved. After Micah dies and the Blackwater money is recovered, Charles does not remain at Beecher's Hope forever. He plans to head north, likely to Canada, and perhaps build a life away from the old violence. This ending is fitting. Charles has always been a man between worlds, and the American world has given him little reason to trust its promises. Canada becomes less a guaranteed paradise than a direction away from the systems that trapped him. He wants something quieter, something not owned by Dutch's ghost, not defined by revenge, not built from outlaw myth. Charles's departure is bittersweet, because he is one of the characters we want to see find peace. The story does not show his final home. It does not tell us whether he marries, has children, finds a community, or finally rests. But the fact that he leaves with the intention of going north feels hopeful. Red Dead Redemption is rarely generous, so even a possible future feels precious. Charles survives with his conscience intact enough to seek something better. His absence from Red Dead Redemption in 1911 is one of those prequel silences that can feel strange at first. Charles is so important to John in the epilogue that one might wonder why he is not present when the Bureau forces John to hunt Bill, Javier, and Dutch. The simplest in-world answer is that Charles has gone north and successfully disappeared from the old life. John would have no reason to drag him back into danger, and the Bureau may not care about him the way it cares about the famous old gunman. There is also an emotional mercy in Charles's absence. If Charles had remained near Beecher's Hope, Ross might have used him, killed him, or forced him into another tragedy. His leaving may be one of the few true escapes in the Red Dead world. He helps John build a home, helps settle the debt to Arthur's memory, and then steps out before the government's later trap closes. He does what Arthur wanted for John. Even if John cannot fully do it himself, he gets out. To understand Charles fully, it helps to slow down inside the years before the gang. Even though the story only gives fragments, those fragments are enough. A boy loses his mother to soldiers. A father breaks under grief and drink. A child leaves home at 13. That is not a full biography, but it is a map of wounds. Charles' adult calm grows from a childhood where calm probably had to be learned the hard way. When there is no stable roof, a person learns to read weather. When there is no reliable guardian, a person learns to read strangers. When home breaks early, a person may spend years deciding what home should even mean. Charles' mixed heritage would have made belonging complicated long before the Linde gang. In one place he might be treated as black first, in another native first, in another simply as a threat because he did not fit the categories people wanted to force onto him. The world around him is obsessed with classification, civilized or savage, white or non-white, legal or criminal, citizen or outsider. Charles lives across boundaries those categories cannot comfortably hold. That helps explain why he does not rush to define himself for others. He already knows many people will define him badly, no matter what he says. This also explains his suspicion of easy belonging. The gang offers him a family, but Charles does not fall into it with the helpless hunger of someone who will accept anything. He accepts companionship, work, food, and a place beside the fire, but keeps a part of himself reserved. That reserve is not coldness, it is wisdom. He has already seen families break, governments steal, and grief hollow out a father. A camp promising freedom may be a gift, but it is still something to watch carefully. Charles's father matters even in absence. The story does not give him many scenes because he is part of Charles's past, but the few facts suggest a man crushed by loss. A loving father who falls apart after his wife is taken gives Charles a difficult inheritance. He learns that love is real, but not always strong enough to withstand history. He learns that grief can turn a parent into someone a child must leave. That knowledge may be why Charles does not judge grief simplistically later. He understands that pain can damage people, but he also understands that damaged people can still hurt those around them. His mother's absence matters even more. Being taken by soldiers is a very specific kind of loss. It is not illness, it is not accident, it is organised force entering a family and removing someone. Charles grows up with the knowledge that power can be impersonal and intimate at the same time. Men in uniforms can carry out orders and still destroy a child's world. Later, when he sees the army surrounding the Wapiti with paperwork, threats and guns, he is not merely politically sympathetic. He is remembering the shape of his own wound. The years after he runs away are almost a hidden novel inside his character. A 13-year-old boy surviving alone in the late 19th century would need to become careful quickly. He would need to know where to sleep, whom to avoid, how to hunt, when to speak, when to stay silent, how to work, how to leave, before trouble became a trap. Charles's adult body carries that education. He is not polished by schools or society. He is shaped by exposure, weather, hunger, and the rough mercy of learning skills before the world can finish punishing him. That is why his competence feels so calm. Some characters perform skill because they want others to see it. Charles seems to carry skill because he had no choice. He knows how to survive because survival was once the entire lesson. He does not make a display of it because display wastes energy. This gives him a special kind of authority. When Charles says something practical, it feels earned. When he warns about waste or danger, the words do not sound like theory. They sound like experience choosing to speak. Charles's early life also makes his emotional restraint understandable. He is not emotionless. He feels deeply, but his feelings are often held under control because uncontrolled emotion may have been dangerous in his youth. Anger at soldiers could not bring his mother back. Despair at his father's drinking could not build a home. Fear on the road could not stop hunger. Charles learned to turn emotion into attention and action. That is why he can be angry at the wasted bison without becoming foolish. He feels the anger, then points it towards something useful. When he joins the gang, he is not looking for Dutch's philosophy in the same way Arthur once did. Arthur was a boy when Dutch found him, young enough to be shaped by a charismatic father figure. Charles is already a grown man. He can appreciate the gang's shelter without needing Dutch to define reality. This difference is quiet but enormous. Dutch can manipulate people most easily when they need him to name the world. Charles does not need that. He has been naming the world for himself for a long time. Hosea likely appeals to Charles more than Dutch does, even if the story does not dwell on their relationship. Hosea's patience, humour and practical caution fit Charles' temperament. Dutch sells destiny. Hosea reads situations. Charles is a reader of situations too. One can imagine him respecting Hosea's ability to measure risk, see through vanity, and keep a little warmth alive in a camp full of dangerous people. Hosea's death removes one of the few older presences who might have understood Charles without demanding too much from him. Arthur's early friendship with Charles grows partly because neither man asks the other to become softer than he is. Arthur does not demand emotional confession. Charles does not demand polished morality. They meet in the middle through work. Hunting, riding, scouting, protecting, fighting when needed. This is one of the most believable forms of friendship in the game. Two guarded men learn that they can trust one another because each does what he says he will do. The hunting trip near Horseshoe Overlook can be read as more than a tutorial in survival. It is a ritual of mutual assessment. Charles watches how Arthur handles the animal, the land and the task. Arthur watches how Charles moves, speaks and judges. By the end, they know something about each other that camp conversation could not provide. They know each other under practical pressure. In the world they live in, that kind of knowledge may be more intimate than a confession. When Charles teaches or advises, he rarely humiliates. This matters. Many men in the gang use knowledge as a way to dominate. They mock, boast, and turn ignorance into weakness. Charles shares knowledge with a different tone. He can be blunt, but he is not cruel for sport. With Arthur, he behaves like someone who assumes competence and then adds what is needed. That makes him a good companion. He does not shrink another person to feel larger. His relationship with John is more distant at first, but it carries its own importance. John begins the story immature, defensive, and unreliable in Arthur's eyes. Charles, being newer, does not carry the same long brotherly resentment. He can see John more cleanly, a man who has failed his family, but not a man beyond repair. This becomes important later, because Charles is able to help John without needing to punish him forever for his past. Charles's presence around Jack is quiet but meaningful. Jack grows up among outlaws, which means every adult around him becomes part of the strange village raising him. Charles is not as playful or openly affectionate as some, but he represents something Jack needs, a strong man who is not foolish with strength. In a camp full of bad examples, Charles is one of the better models. He shows that a man can be dangerous and still gentle, capable and still respectful. Around the camp, Charles's quiet strength is felt most clearly by the people who need steadiness rather than speeches. Abigail's desire for safety is never treated by him as weakness. She wants a real future for Jack, and Charles understands that desire without needing it explained, because he knows what happens when powerful men and violent systems tear families apart. Tilly's old danger with the Foreman brothers draws the same protective instinct from him. He does not turn her past into a spectacle or make a performance out of helping. He simply recognizes that the threat is real and steps toward it. The same camp also holds quieter kinships. Lenny and Charles do not share the same history, but both move through a society that assigns danger to their bodies before knowing their character. Lenny speaks more directly about the racism he faces, while Charles often carries that knowledge silently. But the silence does not mean absence. Mary Beth, in another register, keeps imagination alive with books and writing, while Charles keeps dignity alive through restraint and work. Together, people like Lenny, Tilly, Mary Beth, and Charles remind us that the gang is not only gunmen and robberies, it is full of inner lives that might have belonged to better worlds. Camp survival also shows Charles in a less dramatic but equally important way. Pearson cooks what others bring, and Charles understands the chain between land, animal, labour and stew. Meat on a table is not destiny, it is work. Susan Grimshaw keeps order with a harsher hand, and Charles may not share her methods, but he understands that a camp without effort becomes chaos. Dutch may provide the dream, but the family actually survives through food, discipline, repairs, scouting, guarding, and the dull chores nobody writes songs about. The men around the fire sharpen Charles by contrast. Javier has charm, music, political pain, and real courage, but his loyalty eventually bends toward Dutch when Dutch no longer deserves it. Bill wants to be seen as strong, but often follows louder men because he lacks the inner steadiness Charles already has. Uncle turns laziness into an art form, which irritates Charles most when there is work to do. especially later at Beecher's Hope. Yet even that irritation has warmth, because Charles does not treat the useless or difficult people around him as disposable. He expects effort, but he still understands the messy shape of a family. Sadie belongs slightly apart from the rest of that camp pattern, because her grief burns so brightly. She and Charles both know what it means to survive after a home has been destroyed, though their wounds take different shapes. Suddy's husband is murdered, and her house is burned. Charles loses his mother and leaves a broken father. Neither can return to the original world that made them. Suddy turns grief into fire, Charles turns it into controlled strength. That difference is why their later work together, burying Arthur and helping John, feels so natural. They both know grief is not one moment. It is a road. This woven life around the camp is important because Charles never needs a single spotlight to become meaningful. He is often most visible in the spaces between other people's crises. A sack of meat brought to Pearson, a steady presence near Abigail's fear, a quiet ride beside Arthur, a guarded respect for Tilly's survival, a look of recognition toward Lenny's place in the world, a later hammer lifted beside John. These are not separate little facts lined up on a shelf. They are the same moral habit appearing under different weather. Charles responds to need without making the need about himself. That habit also keeps him from becoming trapped in camp politics. He can care for people individually without becoming loyal to every lie the group tells itself. This is a rare skill. Some characters either surrender completely to the family or reject it in bitterness. Charles does neither. He accepts the warmth that is real, does the work that is necessary, protects the people he can, and keeps enough distance to recognise when Dutch's dream starts poisoning the very people it once sheltered. His place in camp is therefore not a roster of friendships. It is a pattern of careful belonging. That is what makes his quiet movements through camp feel so alive. He is not waiting for a grand moment to reveal who he is. He is already revealing it in small choices, one useful act at a time, long before the story needs him to carry heavier grief. Charles's relationship with Dutch is perhaps the most understated conflict in his arc. He does not rebel early, and he does not openly challenge Dutch the way Arthur eventually does, but his distance is its own judgment. Charles listens to Dutch and helps the gang, but one rarely feels that Dutch has Charles's soul in his hand. Dutch can inspire him for a time, perhaps, but cannot possess him. That makes Charles dangerous to Dutch in a quiet way. He is a useful man who cannot be fully enchanted. Dutch likely senses this, even if he does not say it. Men like Dutch often prefer followers whose doubts can be managed through affection, guilt, or spectacle. Charles is harder to manage because his loyalty is not built from neediness. He helps while the gang still seems worth helping. When the gang begins using people in ways Charles cannot accept, his loyalty has limits. Dutch's tragedy is that he mistakes limited loyalty for betrayal, when in truth it is conscience. Micah is the opposite of Charles in almost every meaningful way. Micah is loud where Charles is quiet, wasteful where Charles is careful, cruel where Charles is restrained, self-serving where Charles is protective. Micah sees the world as a contest of predators and fools. Charles sees danger clearly, but refuses to reduce all life to domination. Their contrast is one of the clearest moral lines in the game. If Charles is strength with conscience, Micah is strength without one. This contrast makes it easy to understand why Micah's rise poisons the camp so completely. Micah creates an environment where cruelty becomes easier to excuse. Charles creates an environment where decency becomes easier to remember. As Dutch chooses Micah more often, the camp shifts away from men like Charles. That shift is the gang's collapse in miniature. A family that listens to Charles may still survive with some dignity. A family that listens to Micah becomes a weapon pointed at itself. Charles's view of Strauss is also worth considering. The story does not place them in a major confrontation, but Strauss's lone business represents a kind of predation Charles would likely despise. Strauss harms desperate people through paper, debt, and social weakness. Charles harms when necessary through direct action. The difference matters. Charles can accept violence tied to survival. Exploiting the poor through ledgers and interest is harder to dress as necessity. Arthur eventually sees that clearly. Charles likely never needed much convincing. The Downs debt that infects Arthur with tuberculosis is not Charles' story directly, but it changes the world Charles must move through. Arthur grows weaker, and Charles is one of the people whose steadiness becomes even more valuable as Arthur's body fails. There is a quiet sadness in imagining what Charles sees. A strong man coughing, changing, becoming more honest as he becomes more fragile. Charles does not crowd Arthur with pity. He lets him remain himself while standing near enough to help. In the Wapiti chapter, Charles's closeness to Arthur becomes almost brotherly. Both men are looking at Dutch and seeing the same wrongness. Arthur is emotionally devastated because Dutch is his father figure. Charles is morally disgusted because Dutch is using wounded people. The two responses meet in action. They help where they can. They protect Rainsfall, Eagle Flies, Monroe, and later John and Abigail in different ways. Their friendship becomes a shared refusal. Rainsfall is one of the few older men in the story who offers a form of wisdom very different from Dutch's. He is restrained, grieving, and trying to preserve life under impossible conditions. Charles respects him, because Rainsfall's restraint is not cowardice. It is care under pressure. Dutch cannot understand that kind of leadership, because Dutch sees restraint as weakness when it limits his drama. Charles understands because his own strength is restrained. Eagle Flies, by contrast, represents rage that Charles also understands. Charles does not dismiss him as foolish. He knows why Eagle Flies is angry. He knows why waiting feels unbearable when every peaceful request is answered with more theft and humiliation. But Charles also knows that Dutch's encouragement is dangerous. Eagle Fly's anger is real. Dutch's use of it is cynical. Charles is one of the few who can hold both truths without flattening either man. This is why Charles's role in the native storyline avoids being simple. He is not written as a man who magically solves the conflict because of his heritage. He cannot save the Wapiti. He cannot undo the army's pressure or Dutch's manipulation. He can help, warn, fight, guide, and mourn. That limitation is important. The story does not hand Charles power over history. It gives him moral clarity inside history's cruelty, and sometimes clarity is not enough to prevent tragedy. Captain Monroe's rescue shows Charles' ability to recognise decency across enemy lines. Monroe belongs to the army, the same broad institution tied to Charles's deepest childhood wound, yet Monroe tries to help the Wapiti and is punished for it. Charles does not reduce him to uniform. He sees the person. This is one of Charles's most admirable traits. He understands systems, but he does not let systems completely erase individual character. A soldier can be part of a harmful machine and still choose something humane. This ability to distinguish person from role also explains why Charles remains fair-minded without being naive. He does not trust institutions easily, but he can honour good action when it appears. That is harder than simple hatred. Hatred can be clean in the mind. Charles lives in a messier truth. The group may be dangerous. and someone inside it may still be worth saving. A gang may be corrupt, and someone inside it may still be family. A violent man may be guilty, and his body may still deserve burial. The burial of Arthur is therefore not only friendship. It is Charles's worldview made visible. A person is not reduced to usefulness. A body is not garbage after the fight is over. A man's final moral turn deserves witness. Arthur dies far from the dream Dutch promised him, but Charles's burial gives the death a human frame. It says this life mattered enough for hands to carry it, dig for it, and mark it. Sadie helping with Arthur's burial makes the act even stronger. Sadie and Charles are two survivors who could have become only revenge and bitterness, but here they perform care. They do not bring Arthur back. They do not undo Dutch's abandonment. They do not erase Arthur's guilt. They do something smaller and truer. They make sure he is not left alone. In Red Dead Redemption 2, small true acts often matter more than grand false ones. Charles' burial of Grimshaw has another emotional colour. Grimshaw is not Arthur. She is harsher, more controlling, and less central to the final redemption arc. But Charles still honours her. That shows his morality is not based only on affection. He recognises long service, shared life, and the dignity of the dead. Grimshaw held the camp together for years, and when she falls, Charles does not let her vanish into the mud of the final betrayal. Between 1899 and 1907, Charles disappears from the main story, and that gap is important. He survives, but survival is not automatically peace. His later presence in St. Denis suggests he has been drifting through work, violence, and necessity. The city is far from the forests and open spaces where Charles seems most himself. Seeing him in underground fights feels wrong in a deliberate way. He is alive, but the world is still making a spectacle of his strength. Prize fighting in St. Denis is one of the saddest uses of Charles's body. In the gang, at least his violence often had a purpose he could morally assess. In the fighting ring, his violence becomes entertainment and income. Men watch, bet, shout, and profit. Charles endures it because he needs money, not because it represents his soul. This is a continuation of the game's larger critique. Modern civilization does not eliminate violence. It organises, sells, and watches it. John finding Charles there is therefore more than a reunion. It is a rescue from a degrading pattern, even if Charles would never ask to be rescued in a helpless way. John gives him a chance to leave that ring and enter a different kind of work. Building Beecher's hope may be exhausting, awkward, and full of Uncle's complaints, but it is constructive. It uses Charles's strength to make shelter instead of spectacle. That difference matters deeply. The house-building sequence has a warmth that Charles helps make believable. Without him, John might still try, but the work would feel more fragile. Charles brings practical knowledge, physical power, and a steady expectation that things can be done properly. He is not sentimental about it. He measures, lifts, cuts and works. The calm dignity of the sequence depends on that grounded labour. It is one of the rare times in Red Dead Redemption where work leads toward home rather than another crime. Uncle's comic presence during the building makes Charles's seriousness more human. Charles can be patient, but not infinitely patient. He pushes back against laziness, complains when work is not shared, and shows little interest in Uncle's excuses. This prevents him from becoming saintly in a flat way. Charles is good, but not endlessly soft. He gets annoyed. He expects effort. His decency includes standards. John needs those standards. He is trying to become the kind of man Abigail can trust, but he has no smooth path into respectable life. He does not know how to build a home emotionally or physically without help. Charles gives help without letting John pretend the work is already done. He stands beside John as someone who believes change is possible but still demands action. In that sense, Charles becomes one of John's best late teachers. The hammering of boards at Beecher's Hope can be heard as the opposite of Dutch's speeches. Dutch builds with language and leaves people in danger. Charles builds with hands and leaves a roof behind. That contrast is almost too perfect, but the story earns it. After years of dreams about somewhere else, there is finally a place being made here. Charles's involvement in that work is one of the most beautiful proofs that he belongs to the story's moral centre. The ranch also gives Charles a temporary home without making him its owner. That matters. He helps build it, lives around it for a while, and contributes to its creation, but he does not claim it as his final destination. Charles is generous enough to help another man build what he himself still lacks. There is sadness in that, but also strength. He is not jealous of John's chance. He honours it because Arthur died for it, and because Jack deserves it. Jack's presence at Beecher's Hope completes part of Charles's moral circle. At the beginning, Jack is a child in a gang camp, vulnerable to the adults' chaos. By the epilogue, Jack has a house rising around him, imperfect but real. Charles helps create the physical conditions for that childhood to become safer. He may not speak of it grandly, but the meaning is there. A man whose own childhood was broken helps build shelter for another child. Abigail's return to John after the house is built also belongs partly to Charles's labour. She returns because John has finally taken visible steps towards stability. Charles helped make those steps real. This is the quiet power of support characters in a story. They may not receive the romantic reunion, but their work creates the space where reunion can happen. Charles stands behind one of John's happiest moments as a builder of the conditions that allow it. The decision to go after Micah threatens that hard-won peace, and Charles's participation is complicated. He knows revenge can poison a person. He has seen Dutch use revenge, grief and anger as excuses for more violence. Yet Micah is not an ordinary enemy. He is the man who helped destroy the family, endangered Abigail and Jack, betrayed Arthur, and fed Dutch's worst instincts. Charles goes because the past has not been buried completely. Some wounds keep calling from the mountain. Charles's presence on the Mount Hagen ride also keeps the revenge from feeling purely reckless. Sadie is driven by fire. John is driven by debt to Arthur and his own anger. Charles brings gravity. He does not make the mission safe, and perhaps he cannot make it wise, but he makes it feel witnessed by conscience. If even Charles is willing to go, the journey carries more than bloodlust. It carries the demand that Micah's survival not be the final word over Arthur's death. The injury Charles suffers on the mountain is another reminder that loyalty costs. He does not reach the final confrontation in the same way John does, but his sacrifice along the route is real. Charles often gives his body to help others survive, and the mountain repeats that pattern. He is not invulnerable. He bleeds, falls back, and endures. The story respects him enough to show strength under damage, rather than pretending strength means never being hurt. After the Micah mission, Charles' decision to leave becomes even more understandable. The revenge has been completed, Arthur has been honoured, John has money for the ranch, the old debt has been answered as much as it ever can be. Staying would risk turning memory into another chain. Charles seems to understand that endings must be accepted when they arrive. He has done what friendship asked of him. Now he must seek his own life. The idea of Charles going to Canada carries historical and emotional weight. Canada was not free of racism or hardship. but it represented a possible northward escape from certain American pressures. For Charles, it may mean distance from the law, distance from old gang names, distance from the violence of the frontier's closing machinery. It may also mean a place where he can work, breathe, and perhaps live without being constantly pulled into other men's dreams. The story does not show his arrival, and that absence is a gift. Red Dead Redemption often follows characters until their hopes are crushed. Charles leaving the frame before that can happen allows hope to remain possible. We do not need to see every mile. We do not need to watch him find a cabin, a job, a family, or a lonely road. The open ending lets Charles keep a future. In this world, an unseen, peaceful future may be the kindest ending available. There is comfort in that unseen future because Charles has earned privacy. So many lives in Red Dead Redemption 2 are exposed at their worst moments, turned into spectacle by violence, law, gossip, or grief. Charles spends much of his life being seen through other people's needs. The North gives him the possibility of becoming ordinary somewhere beyond the story's reach, and ordinary life, for a man like Charles, may be the rarest victory. Charles also changes how Arthur's redemption is remembered. Without Charles and Suddy, Arthur might remain only in John's private grief and the mountain sunrise. Because Charles buries him, Arthur's redemption receives a place. A grave is a physical argument against forgetting. It says the man existed, died, and deserves to be visited. Charles gives Arthur's story one of its most important afterlives. That afterlife continues through John. When John builds Beecher's hope, Charles is there. When John confronts Micah, Charles is there. When John tries to become a better father and husband, Charles has helped make the attempt possible. Arthur's last choice sends John away from the mountain. Charles helps John turn that escape into a life, however temporary. This makes Charles a bridge between Arthur's ending and John's beginning. Charles is also a bridge between the gang and the world outside it. Many gang members are defined almost entirely by their relationship to Dutch's family. Charles is not. He has a past before the gang that feels strong, and a future after it that feels possible. This makes him less trapped by the Van der Linde myth. He enters, contributes, loves some of them, rejects the rot, honours the dead, and exits. That arc is rare. Most characters are consumed by the gang one way or another. His ability to exit is not accidental. It comes from having an identity before Dutch and a conscience beyond Dutch. Arthur struggles to leave because Dutch raised him. John struggles because the gang formed his youth and because the later government drags him back. Charles has attachments, but his centre remains elsewhere. That elsewhere may be painful and lonely, but it gives him the strength to walk away. Charles's solitude should not be romanticised too much. Being able to walk away often means having had to survive alone before. His independence is admirable, but it comes from loss. The same life that protects him from Dutch's emotional control also deprived him of stable belonging. This is part of his tragedy. He is free from certain chains because the world broke other bonds early. His strength is real, but it was expensive. The story's treatment of Charles avoids giving him a conventional romance or family resolution. That absence keeps the focus on his internal and moral journey. He is not rewarded with a neat domestic ending on screen. Instead, he is granted direction. This feels true to him. Charles is not a character who needs a tidy final scene with every question answered. He needs a road that is his own, and the story finally gives him one. If there is a sorrow in his ending, it is that he must leave people he cares about to preserve himself. John, Abigail, Jack, uncle, Sadie, and the memory of Arthur all remain behind in some way, but staying near them would mean staying near the old violence too. Charles understands that love cannot always mean remaining close. Sometimes love means helping build the house, then leaving before one's own life disappears into someone else's story. This is another way Charles differs from Arthur. Arthur stays until he has almost nothing left, then uses the end to save John. Charles helps, but leaves while he still has a future. Arthur's tragedy is late moral clarity under death. Charles's wisdom is moral clarity before death forces it. He does not need to spend his whole life paying for Dutch's dream. He gives what is needed and then chooses the possibility of peace. Charles also differs from Sadie in this way. Sadie survives, but revenge and danger continue calling her. She becomes a bounty hunter, a woman whose grief has transformed into motion she may never fully stop. Charles can fight beside her, respect her, and love Arthur's memory with equal seriousness, but he does not seem to want the same life of endless pursuit. He wants distance from violence, not a profession built around it. That difference makes both characters richer. In a story about the death of the West, Charles represents an older relationship to land than the frontier myth usually allows. Dutch talks about open country as freedom for outlaws. Settlers talk about land as property. Industrialists talk about land as resource. The army treats land as territory to control. Charles understands land as life, memory, movement and responsibility. He hunts on it, reads it, respects it, and mourns when it is wasted. The bison mission is therefore not a side anecdote. It is the key to Charles's worldview. To waste a bison is to show contempt for life, for people who depend on that life, and for the balance that makes survival possible. The men who shoot and leave carcasses are spiritually related to the forces destroying the wapiti. They take without respect. Charles's anger is not only about animals, it is about a way of being in the world that turns everything living into target, profit, or insult. Arthur learns from that anger because Arthur has spent much of his life taking. He takes debts, money, lives, horses, supplies, and orders. Near Charles, he begins to feel the difference between taking for survival and taking because a corrupt system demands it. Charles does not need to accuse Arthur directly. He shows another standard. Arthur's conscience, already alive beneath layers of denial, responds to that standard. Charles's role in Arthur's moral awakening is subtle enough to be easy to miss. Sister Calderon gives Arthur words. Rain's fall gives him sorrowful wisdom. Edith Downs gives him the face of harm. John gives him a future worth saving. Charles gives him an example of strength that does not require self-deception. This example matters. Arthur has been strong for Dutch for decades. Charles shows him how to be strong without surrendering judgment. In that sense, Charles is one of Arthur's quiet teachers. Not a teacher with lectures, but a teacher through conduct. He shows Arthur how to be angry without becoming cruel, how to kill without enjoying waste, how to help without needing praise, how to walk away from a leader who is using people. Arthur's final goodness is his own, but Charles is one of the people who makes that goodness easier to see. The same is true for John. John learns from Arthur's sacrifice, Abigail's demands, and his own failures, but Charles teaches him through work. The house at Beecher's Hope is almost a classroom. Each board says that a future is not imagined into being. It is built badly at first, then better through effort. Charles's presence turns the dream of domestic life into a task John can actually touch. Charles's ability to build is the other side of his ability to fight. Many men in Red Dead can destroy. fewer can construct, Charles can do both, and he seems to value construction more. This makes him one of the story's most balanced figures. He can clear threats, but he can also raise shelter. He can bury the dead, but he can also help the living sleep under a roof. Destruction and care both pass through his hands, and care is the one that feels closer to his heart. There is a reason Charles feels peaceful even when discussing violence. He has inner alignment. He may suffer, doubt, grieve, and get angry, but he is not constantly performing a false self. Dutch is always performing Dutch. Micah is always performing dominance. John is often performing toughness to cover insecurity. Arthur performs indifference to hide tenderness. Charles performs the least. He is guarded, yes, but not false in the same way. This lack of false performance makes him restful in the story. When Charles is present, there is often a sense that someone sensible is in the room. That does not mean everything will be safe. It means at least one person is likely to see the situation without turning it into ego. In a gang increasingly ruled by ego, that is a rare comfort. Charles becomes a kind of emotional steady hand. His anger, when it appears, lands harder because of that steadiness. A constantly angry character can become noise. Charles's anger has weight because it is not constant. When he is disgusted by wasted bison, when he worries about the wapiti, when he sees Dutch using people, the feeling carries authority. The story has taught us he does not rage for entertainment. If Charles is angry, something has truly gone wrong. His silence works the same way. A silent Charles is not empty. He is processing, watching, measuring. Sometimes his silence suggests respect, sometimes grief, sometimes distrust. The performance of the character relies on restraint, and that restraint allows small changes to matter. A look, a pause, a short line from Charles can carry more than a whole speech from someone else. Because Charles is so restrained, his acts of friendship feel especially warm. Helping Arthur, helping John, burying the dead, joining the ride to Mount Hagen, building the house, these are declarations from a man who does not declare much. He may not say "I love you, brother," in a grand way, but his actions say something close. In Charles's language, staying to help is affection. Riding into danger is affection. Digging a grave is affection. This is why his story fits so naturally beside a quiet fire. His life has motion, but not frantic motion. He moves like a steady horse through hard country. He appears in snow, grass, swamp, city, mountain and ranch, always carrying the same grounded presence. Following him slowly allows the larger chaos of Red Dead Redemption 2 to become calmer, not because the events are gentle, but because Charles meets them with gravity. Charles' moral clarity does not make him judgmental in a shallow way. He can work with criminals and still know crime is ugly. He can love people who have done wrong and still leave when their wrongness becomes poisonous. This is a mature moral stance. He does not need everyone to be pure before he helps them, but he also does not let affection blind him forever. He walks the thin road between mercy and discernment better than almost anyone. His relationship to the Van der Linde gang is therefore best described as chosen but conditional family. He chooses to ride with them. He shares food, danger, and loyalty. But when the condition of shared decency breaks, his deeper loyalty shifts toward individuals rather than the group. Arthur, John, Abigail, Jack, Sadie, the wapiti, the dead. Charles does not betray family by leaving Dutch. He saves the meaning of family from Dutch's misuse of the word. This becomes one of the clearest lessons of his life. Family is not the person who demands obedience while leading everyone into ruin. Family is the one who comes back to bury you. Family is the one who helps build the house. Family is the one who risks the mountain because the dead deserve justice. Family is not only blood, and it is not only loyalty. It is care with responsibility attached. Charles's own lack of a stable blood family makes this chosen family idea even more meaningful. His mother is gone, his father is broken by drink and grief. The gang becomes a possible replacement, then fails. John and Abigail's home becomes a temporary repair, not a final belonging. Charles keeps searching for a form of family that will not collapse into control or dependency. His final northward path suggests he may still believe such a thing can exist. That belief is quiet, but not naive. Charles has seen too much to believe peace comes easily. He knows a road north will still contain hunger, racism, cold, work, and risk. But he also knows staying in the old orbit means more violence. Hope, for Charles, is not a bright speech. It is a practical decision to move toward a place where the next day's work might not betray the soul. That is a very grown-up kind of hope. Charles Smith's lore is therefore not a simple side story. It is one of the moral backbones of Red Dead Redemption 2. He is not the protagonist, but he helps define what goodness looks like in a world where goodness is rarely clean. He is violent but not cruel, loyal but not blind, quiet but not passive, wounded but not self-pitying, skilled but not boastful. He belongs to the gang, but never fully belongs to its delusions. That balance makes him one of the most important figures in the story. One of the most interesting things about Charles is that he rarely needs to announce his beliefs. Many characters in Red Dead Redemption 2 explain themselves constantly. Dutch explains his philosophy, Micah explains his contempt, Arthur explains himself in his journal because he cannot always speak. John argues with Abigail and himself. Charles, by contrast, lets action carry meaning. He hunts respectfully. He helps the Wapiti. He buries Arthur. He builds John's house. These acts are his speeches. This is why Charles's quietness should never be mistaken for emptiness. He is quiet because he is full of memory, loss, discipline, anger, restraint, and observation. He does not spill himself into every conversation, because he does not need to prove he exists. In a gang where many men are terrified of being insignificant, Charles has a different kind of strength. He can stand at the edge of the fire and still be one of the most present people there. Charles also represents a form of masculinity that Red Dead Redemption 2 treats with deep respect. He is physically powerful, brave, and capable in a fight, but he is not emotionally childish about strength. He does not need to dominate every room. He does not confuse cruelty with courage. He does not treat women, animals, or vulnerable people as proof of his own power. His strength is protective, practical, and often gentle. In a violent Western story, that kind of manhood matters. Arthur's friendship with Charles becomes especially powerful because Arthur is learning, near the end, to separate strength from obedience. For much of Arthur's life, being strong meant serving Dutch's needs. Charles shows another version. Being strong can mean refusing waste, protecting the vulnerable, walking away from a bad leader, and honouring the dead. Arthur does not become Charles, but he sees in Charles a kind of integrity that helps him name what is missing in Dutch. John's friendship with Charles is different, but equally important. John needs models of steady adulthood. Dutch gave him charisma and chaos. Arthur gave him rough love and final sacrifice. Charles gives him practical help and quiet expectation. He He does not rescue John from responsibility, he helps John meet it. That is why the house building section feels so healing. Charles is not doing the work instead of John, he is doing it beside him. Sadie's relationship with Charles also deserves attention. They are very different survivors. Sadie is fire, grief, and forward motion. Charles is stillness, patience, and controlled force. Both are deeply wounded by the gang's collapse, and both carry Arthur's memory into the epilogue. Together, they help John confront Micah, but they do not feel the same about violence. Sadie often burns with revenge. Charles seems more aware of its cost. Their partnership works because it combines urgency with steadiness. Charles' connection to animals is one of the softest parts of his lore. He understands hunting, but he also understands respect. He reacts strongly to wasted bison. He treats horses as living companions rather than tools. He moves through wilderness as someone who listens. This gives him a spiritual quality that is never overstated. He is not written as a mystical stereotype. He is written as a person whose survival has taught him attention. Attention, in his case, becomes ethics. Attention is perhaps the key to Charles Smith. He notices what others miss. He notices the land. He notices when killing becomes waste. He notices the suffering of the Wapiti. He notices Arthur's decency beneath the roughness. He notices Dutch's manipulation without needing to scream about it. He notices what John is trying to become. In a story full of men blinded by dreams, fear, greed, and ego, Charles's ability to notice is almost sacred. His mixed heritage also gives him a kind of double vision. He understands that America is not one story. He carries the history of black survival and native dispossession in his family line. He knows that the freedom Dutch talks about is not available equally to everyone. He knows the law does not mean the same thing for a wealthy industrialist, a white outlaw, a black man, a native family, or a poor immigrant. This knowledge makes him less naive than some around him. At the same time, Charles is not written only as a symbol of suffering. He has humour, irritation, warmth, and preference. He can tease. He can be blunt. He can get frustrated with Uncle. He can enjoy company while still needing distance. He is not a walking lesson. He is a man who has been shaped by history without being reduced to it. That is one reason he remains so memorable. He feels complete, even when the story only gives him limited space. The fact that Charles joined the gang only recently also means he offers a glimpse of what the Van der Linde family looked like from the outside. Older members often speak as if the gang has always been a sacred family. Charles shows that the gang still had enough charisma and usefulness to attract someone with good instincts shortly before its collapse. That is important. The gang was not obviously doomed to everyone at first glance. It still looked, in moments, like a possible refuge. This makes Dutch's failure even worse. He had people like Charles near him, people whose strength and conscience could have helped the gang become more honest. But Dutch did not want honest counsel as much as he wanted devotion. Charles' presence is proof that the gang had the raw material for something better. It had hunters, builders, protectors, carers, and people capable of moral courage. Dutch's tragedy is that he could gather such people, but not truly serve them. Charles never becomes the leader, because that is not his role. But one can imagine that a smaller group led by someone like Charles would have made very different choices. It would not have chased grand scores in Saint-Denis. It would not have used the Wapiti for distraction. It would not have kept Micah close for flattery. It might still have been criminal, wounded and hunted, but it would have been less theatrical and less self-deceived. Charles represents the path Dutch could never take, practical survival without myth. The myth of the outlaw does not seduce Charles in the same way. He does not seem interested in being remembered as a legend. He is not trying to become a famous gunslinger, revolutionary, or folk hero. He wants to live with dignity. That simple desire is easy to overlook in a dramatic Western world, but it is profound. Many characters destroy themselves because they need life to mean something grand. Charles seems to understand that meaning can be smaller and better. Food, shelter, respect, a clean kill, a proper burial, a road north. His proper burial instinct is especially important because Red Dead Redemption 2 is full of improper death. Bodies are left in snow, swamps, streets, burning houses, battlefields, prison camps, and ruined hideouts. Violence often treats the dead as scenery. Charles refuses that when he can. He buries Arthur. He buries Grimshaw. He honours the dead as people who still deserve care after their usefulness ends. That is one of the clearest measures of his soul. The way Charles treats Arthur after death also heals something in the story's emotional world. Arthur spent so much of his life being useful to Dutch. He collected debts, killed enemies, brought money, protected camp, and carried the dream. Near the end, Dutch treats him as disposable once he becomes inconvenient. Charles, by burying him, says the opposite. Arthur's value did not end when his body stopped serving the gang. That act gives Arthur the dignity Dutch denied him. Charles's survival is not without cost. He carries grief, injury, displacement, and moral exhaustion. The epilogue shows him fighting for money, not living in perfect peace. This keeps his ending from becoming too easy. He is one of the best men in the story, but being good does not automatically protect him from hard circumstances. The world still uses bodies like his. The difference is that Charles keeps choosing a direction away from corruption when he can. That direction north is one of the most hopeful images connected to him. North can mean cold, distance, wilderness, and difficulty, but it also means away. Away from Dutch's dream, away from Micah's poison, away from St. Denis crowds betting on his pain, away from the Bureau's future pressure, away from the collapse of the American frontier into something even more controlled. Charles's north is not guaranteed safety, but it is chosen movement. For him, that matters. Charles Smith's entire arc can be understood as the search for a home that does not ask him to betray himself. His childhood home is broken by soldiers and grief. The Van der Linde gang offers shelter, but becomes morally poisoned. St. Denis offers money through violence, but not peace. Beecher's hope offers temporary fellowship and constructive work, but it is John's home, not his final home. Canada or the North becomes the imagined place where Charles may finally belong without being used. This search for home connects him to almost every major character. Arthur wants a moral home before death, a place inside himself where he can rest. John wants a physical home for Abigail and Jack. Sadie loses her home and never fully stops moving. Dutch promises a home somewhere else, but uses the promise to control people. Charles quietly moves through all of these desires with a steadier understanding. Home cannot be built on lies, exploitation, or performance. It must be made through care. Care is the word that keeps returning to Charles. He cares for animals by refusing waste. He cares for people by helping without spectacle. He cares for the dead by burying them. He cares for the land by listening to it. He cares for John by building with him. He cares for Arthur by honouring him. He cares for the Wapiti by standing beside them as people, not symbols. Charles's law is the law of care inside a violent world. This is why he is so perfect for a slow telling. His story does not depend on one enormous twist. It deepens through attention. A hunting trip, a look of disgust at wasted bison, a quiet ride with Arthur, a warning about Dutch's choices, a body buried, a board nailed into place, a plan to leave. Charles's life is made of steady moral gestures rather than explosions of ego. The longer one sits with him, the more those gestures gather weight. He is also one of the few characters whose ending does not feel like punishment. Arthur dies redeemed. John survives for a while but is doomed by the first game's future. Sadie survives but remains restless. Dutch survives as a hollow myth. Charles leaves. That leaving is not dramatic in the way a gunfight is dramatic, but it may be the wisest ending anyone gets. He does not need to die to prove he mattered. He does not need to stay to prove loyalty. He helps, honours, and then goes. There is a quiet lesson in that. Loyalty is not the same as permanent attachment. Charles is loyal to people, not to a collapsing structure. He is loyal to Arthur's memory, John's effort, the Wapiti's suffering, and the dead who need burial. He is not loyal to Dutch's self-serving dream once that dream becomes harmful. This distinction is one of the healthiest moral ideas in the entire game. Loyalty without conscience becomes a cage. Charles keeps the conscience. There is also a broader historical sadness around Charles that reaches beyond the gang. Red Dead Redemption 2 is set at the end of an era, but for Charles the phrase end of an era is not romantic. It means the tightening of systems that already harmed his family. Railroads, oil companies, banks, armies, private detectives, government agencies, and fenced property all carry different kinds of pressure. Some characters mourn the end of outlaw freedom. Charles carries a deeper knowledge. The same civilization that crushes outlaws also crushed people who were never granted fair access to its promises in the first place. This is why Charles is not nostalgic in the same way Dutch is. Dutch longs for a past where men like him could ride free, rob, charm, and vanish. Charles has less reason to idealise that past. The old frontier was never innocent for black families or native families. The new industrial order is not innocent either. Charles stands between eras without pretending either one is clean. That makes his perspective wiser than Dutch's romance, and harsher than John's hope for domestic peace. The closing of the frontier means something different when seen through Charles. For Dutch, it is the death of his myth. For Arthur, it becomes the setting of his final reckoning. For John, it becomes the world he must enter if he wants Abigail and Jack to be safe. For Charles, it is another chapter in a long pattern of displacement. He has already known what it means for powerful people to decide where others may live, move, hunt, work, and belong. The national story is written on his family before it is written on the gang. This is part of why he treats land with respect. Land is not only scenery or opportunity, it is memory, food, burial, route, danger, and home. When Charles hunts, he enters a relationship with land. When Dutch talks about land, it often becomes a fantasy of escape. When Cornwall looks at land, it becomes extraction. When the army looks at land, it becomes control. Charles' way is quieter and more responsible. He does not own the land through speech. He listens to it. Listening is one of Charles's hidden powers. He listens to the forest when hunting. He listens to tone when people speak. He listens to what is not said in camp. He listens to the suffering behind Rainsfall's restraint and Eagleflies' rage. He listens to Arthur's changing spirit without forcing confession. This ability to listen makes him effective because he is not always trying to overwrite reality with his own need. Dutch cannot listen like that. Micah would not even try. The difference between Charles and Dutch is especially clear in how each man handles people in pain. Dutch sees pain as material for recruitment. If someone is angry, Dutch can use that anger. If someone is scared, Dutch can offer protection. If someone is rejected by society, Dutch can turn that rejection into loyalty to himself. Charles sees pain as something to be respected before it is touched. He does not rush to make another person's suffering serve his plan. That is why Charles' involvement with the Wapiti feels morally clean, while Dutch's involvement feels poisonous. Both men stand near the same conflict. Both oppose the army at certain moments. But Charles is trying to reduce harm where he can, while Dutch is trying to redirect harm toward his own advantage. The outside action may sometimes look similar, but the inner motive is different. Red Dead Redemption 2 cares deeply about that difference. Charles also shows that moral goodness does not require optimism. He is not cheerful about the world. He does not believe everything will work out if people simply try hard enough. He has seen too much for that. His goodness is not based on believing the world is kind. It is based on choosing not to add unnecessary cruelty to a world that is already hard. That is a stronger and more believable form of decency. This form of decency is why Charles can survive the story without seeming untouched by it. He is not innocent in the sense of never having harmed anyone. He has killed, he has stolen, he has ridden with outlaws, he has made compromises. But he keeps returning to a moral line: do not waste life, do not exploit the vulnerable, do not follow a leader into obvious corruption, do not forget the dead, do not let revenge become the only language left. These lines are not perfect law, they are survival ethics. Survival ethics are different from clean morality. Clean morality is easy to describe from a safe room. Charles lives in a world where every choice is contaminated by hunger, racism, danger, poverty, and violence. He cannot simply live outside harm. Instead, he tries to limit harm, direct strength toward protection, and recognize when a situation has become too rotten to keep serving. That is why his choices feel believable. He is not pure. He is careful. Charles' carefulness extends to the way he speaks. He often chooses short lines because he does not waste words either. This gives his dialogue a grounded force. When he comments on waste, danger, or Dutch's behaviour, the line lands because it has not been surrounded by performance. He is like the opposite of Dutch in language. Dutch turns simple things into speeches. Charles turns complicated things into plain truth. Plain truth can be threatening in a world built on fantasy. Dutch's fantasy needs constant maintenance. It needs speeches, enemies, promises, destinations, and believers. Charles' plainness cuts through that without dramatic rebellion. He simply does not feed the fantasy more than necessary. A man like Dutch can handle open opposition by turning it into betrayal. What he cannot easily handle is someone who quietly refuses to be impressed. Arthur, near the end, begins to share that refusal. He stops being impressed by Dutch's words and starts measuring actions. Charles has been measuring actions all along. This is one reason their late friendship feels so strong. Arthur is not becoming someone entirely new. He is finally trusting the part of himself that men like Charles had quietly supported. The two men meet in a moral clearing near the end of Arthur's life, and that clearing is one of the gentlest places in the whole tragedy. John reaches that clearing later and less gracefully. He needs years, failures, Abigail's anger, Arthur's sacrifice, and Charles' practical help before he can stand inside a different life. Charles does not mock him for needing time. He has enough patience to help John build slowly. That patience is not softness without standards. It is the patience of someone who knows people do not become better just because a better life is offered. They have to learn how to inhabit it. The house at Beecher's Hope is almost a test of inhabiting a better life. John can shoot. John can ride. John can survive. But can he build? Can he stay? Can he repair a relationship without running? Charles helps him answer yes, at least for a while. He brings the kind of strength that does not escalate the situation. A gun escalates. A hammer builds. Charles knows both tools, but the hammer at Beecher's Hope may be the truer image of his soul. This is why the epilogue has such a different emotional texture when Charles is present. Sadie brings momentum. Uncle brings comedy and irritation. Abigail brings the emotional stakes. Jack brings the future. Charles brings grounded faith in work. Not religious faith, not Dutch's faith, but the kind of faith that says if boards are cut and lifted and nailed, a wall will stand. After so many broken promises, that simple cause and effect feels almost holy. Charles's body is central to his story, but not in a shallow way. The world repeatedly uses his body for hunting, fighting, labour, survival, prize matches and construction. Yet Charles refuses to let his body be the whole measure of him. He is physically strong, but the story keeps showing the mind and conscience inside the strength. That matters because racist worlds often reduce men like Charles to body, threat, labour, or spectacle. The narrative pushes back by giving him interior dignity. The St. Denis fighting ring is the clearest example of that reduction. Spectators look at his body as entertainment. They want impact, blood, victory, and money. They may not care who he is beyond what he can endure. When John finds him, the scene carries relief because Charles is pulled back into relationship. He is no longer only the fighter in front of a crowd. He is Charles again, friend, builder, survivor, moral witness. His scarred and battered condition in the epilogue also reminds us that survival has a physical cost. Charles has not floated untouched through the years. His strength has been spent over and over. The body remembers every fight, every cold night, every wound, every mile. But he is still moving. The fact that he can still choose generosity after being used by the world is one of the most powerful things about him. Charles's generosity is never naive because he knows people can betray it. Dutch betrays the gang. Micah betrays everyone. Institutions betray the vulnerable. The world betrays families like his. Yet Charles still helps. That is the measure of his strength. A person who has never been hurt may help because helping is easy. Charles helps after learning exactly how unsafe goodness can be. That makes his goodness more impressive, not less. The shape of his life also makes him one of the best examples of non-verbal storytelling in Red Dead Redemption 2. Many of the most important things about Charles are communicated through where he stands, what he does, who he helps, and what makes him angry. His story trusts quiet evidence. This is rare in a game full of unforgettable dialogue. Charles proves that silence can carry law when the actions are specific enough. His law also deepens the meaning of the gang's campfire. Around the fire, people sing songs, tell stories, flirt, argue and drink. Charles may sit nearby, participating sometimes and watching at other times. For him, the fire is not just atmosphere, it is temporary belonging. A man who has been alone for years can sit close enough to warmth, without surrendering all of himself. The fire is comfort, but it is not possession. That temporary belonging is one of the saddest beauties of the gang. For a while it gives people like Charles a circle to sit in. It gives Tilly safety, Jack play, Karen laughter, Javier songs, Pearson purpose, and Arthur something like family. The tragedy is that this real warmth is attached to Dutch's unstable dream. Charles's story helps us understand both truths at once. The gang was not fake in every way. That is why its corruption hurts. If the gang had been only evil, leaving it would be easy. Charles' arc has weight because the gang contains people worth loving. He does not walk away from nothing. He walks away from a community that gave him some shelter and then began endangering the very people it claimed to protect. That is a much harder decision. It requires moral vision, not simple disgust. Charles's willingness to continue helping select members after the gang collapses shows that he understands this distinction. He does not reject everyone because Dutch failed. He does not decide the whole past was worthless. He honours Arthur, helps John, works with Sadie, and remembers the dead. He separates the living bonds from the rotten structure. That ability is part of why he survives with his heart intact. The revenge against Micah tests that heart. Revenge can easily become the rotten structure returning under a new name. Charles goes, but he does not appear to build a life around revenge afterward. That is key. He participates in one final reckoning, then leaves. Suddy may continue as a bounty hunter. John returns home with money that will later draw consequences. Charles steps away. He refuses to let revenge become his permanent home. This makes his ending feel wiser than John's, even though John gets the house. John has the domestic dream, but cannot fully escape the old pull. Charles does not have a house on screen, but he may have a better instinct for leaving danger behind. The story is not mocking John, it loves him too much for that. But it lets Charles carry a form of wisdom John has not mastered. Sometimes survival means not only building, but knowing when to move on. Charles's relationship with Arthur's grave also suggests that memory can remain without entrapment. He honours Arthur, but does not live at the grave. He helps John because of Arthur, but does not become Arthur's ghost. He carries memory as responsibility, not as a chain. This is another kind of balance. Forgetting would be betrayal. Living only in grief would be another death. Charles chooses the middle path. The middle path defines him in many ways, between black and native heritage, between outlaw family and outsider independence, between violence and gentleness, between grief and action, between helping and leaving, between revenge and peace. Charles is not split because he is weak. He is balanced because he has learned that life rarely gives one pure category to stand inside. His strength is the ability to remain whole while standing between. That wholeness is hard won. A mixed heritage in a racist world can be used by others to make a person feel divided, never enough for one group or the other, always seen through someone else's confusion. Charles does not appear confused about his own worth. He may be lonely, but he is not ashamed. That quiet self-possession is one of the most dignified parts of him. He belongs to himself even when the world struggles to place him. His self-possession also prevents him from becoming a tool of any one ideology. Dutch cannot turn him into a disciple. The army cannot turn him into a stereotype. St. Denis cannot turn him completely into entertainment. The old gang cannot keep him forever. Even grief cannot make him only vengeful. Charles can be pressured, hurt, and used temporarily, but the deepest part of him keeps returning to itself. The beauty of Charles Smith is that his heroism is not announced by the story with bright lights. It appears in the kind of acts that might be overlooked if one only follows gunfire. He brings food. He reads tracks. He steps in when someone is threatened. He objects to waste. He helps the wapiti. He buries friends. He builds a house. He leaves before bitterness becomes identity. These are not small acts when placed against the world he inhabits. They are the structure of a good life under bad conditions. Seen chapter by chapter, Charles' emotional route has a very careful shape. In Coulter, he is survival. In Horseshoe Overlook, he is trust beginning to form. In Clemens Point, he is quiet witness inside a region heavy with old racial violence. In Shady Belle, he is steadiness in a house built on decay. After Guarma, he is moral clarity, while Dutch becomes harder to excuse. In Beaver Hollow, he is one of the last signs that the gang still contains goodness, even though the gang itself is dying. That chapter-by-chapter movement matters because Charles does not need a sudden transformation scene. Some characters change like a door breaking open. Charles changes like a trail becoming clearer the longer one walks it. At first, he seems like a capable new member. Then he becomes Arthur's trusted friend. Then a moral witness. Then a defender of the wapiti. Then a mourner. Then a builder. The arc is gradual, but by the end it is unmistakable. Coulter shows the first layer. Charles can be relied on when everything is stripped down to need. No money, no comfort, no grand stage, no warm weather, no easy escape. Only cold, hunger, and work. Charles belongs in that chapter because he is built for the moment when romantic outlaw talk no longer helps. He is one of the people who make survival possible before the gang has time to pretend survival was part of a beautiful plan. Horseshoe Overlook shows the second layer. Charles can belong without losing himself. The camp is at its most relaxed there, and Charles is able to sit inside the community without becoming swallowed by it. He hunts, talks, helps, and slowly becomes part of the group's rhythm. But even in that warm chapter, there is a reserve in him. He is close, but not captured. The difference between those two states becomes more important later. Clemens Point and Rhodes show the third layer. Charles carries history through places others treat as opportunity. The gang sees money in the Grey and Braithwaite feud. Dutch sees leverage. Hosea sees a con. Arthur sees work and danger. Charles's presence quietly reminds the story that the region has deeper violence under its manners. His silence in Lemoyne is not emptiness. It is the silence of a man moving through land where old cruelty still has a smell. Shady Belle shows the fourth layer. Charles can live inside a haunted shelter without mistaking it for home. The ruined mansion gives the gang wars, but not peace. Charles seems especially suited to understanding that difference. Shelter is not the same as home. A roof can hide rot. A beautiful house can be built from suffering. The gang occupies Shady Belle, but it never truly belongs there, and Charles's grounded presence helps that unease register. The post-Guarma chapters show the fifth layer. Charles becomes more necessary as the older structure fails. Hosea is gone, Arthur is sick, Dutch is unstable, and the gang's moral centre is sliding. Charles does not replace Hosea or Arthur, but he helps hold a line. He moves toward the wapiti, toward Arthur's clearer judgment, toward people who need help rather than people who need flattering. His allegiance becomes more selective, and therefore more meaningful. Beaver Hollow shows the sixth layer. Charles can stand near collapse without surrendering to it. The cave camp is the ugliest expression of Dutch's dream, and many people there are frightened, bitter, or confused. Charles does not save the gang, because the gang is beyond saving, but he does not let its ugliness define him. This is one of his greatest victories. he leaves that darkness with enough integrity to bury the dead and build for the living. The epilogue shows the final layer. Charles can survive the story and still choose usefulness without servitude. In Saint Denis, his strength is being sold in fights. At Beecher's Hope, the same strength becomes construction. On Mount Hagen, it becomes loyalty to Arthur's memory. Afterward, it becomes movement north. His body has been used by many situations, but by the end, he begins using his life for his own direction. This is why Charles's lore feels so complete even without a final on-screen destination. The story does not need to show him arriving in Canada because it has already shown the important change. He is no longer trapped in someone else's dream. Dutch's dream, Corinth of outlaw myth, St. Denis spectators, even John's house. None of these can finally own him. He helps, then moves. For Charles, movement with conscience is a kind of freedom. There is also a spiritual quiet to Charles that never becomes explicit religion. He does not preach, he does not claim visions, he does not need sacred language. But his relationship to animals, land, burial and respectful action gives him an almost ceremonial quality. He treats certain acts as if they matter beyond immediate usefulness. A clean hunt matters, a wasted bison matters, a proper grave matters, a house built for a child matters. That is spirituality without performance. This makes him one of the best counters to the hollow ceremony of Dutch's leadership. Dutch creates rituals of speech, gather around, listen, believe, have faith, wait for the plan. Charles creates rituals of care, hunt properly, help quietly, bury the dead, build the wall, leave when the work is done. One ritual drains people into a man's ego, the other returns dignity to a hard world. The contrast is gentle, but devastating. Charles's final meaning may be that redemption does not always look like confession. Arthur needs to confess because he has spent so long lying to himself. John needs to prove change because he has failed Abigail and Jack. Dutch refuses confession and becomes a ruin. Charles does not need a dramatic confession because he has been living closer to his truth all along. His redemption, if the word applies, is not a turn from evil to good. It is the preservation of good under pressure. That preserved good is why his story can rest without needing tragedy to validate it. Some stories act as if a good character must die to matter. Charles matters because he lives. He matters because he survives the gang, survives poverty, survives revenge, and still seeks a future. In a world so full of graves, his departure north is not a loose end. It is a mercy. It lets one good man ride out of the frame before the world can take everything from him. If Arthur's story is about late redemption, Charles's story is about preserved integrity. Arthur changes dramatically because death forces him to see clearly. Charles does not need the same kind of transformation because he begins the story with clearer eyes. That does not make him simple. It makes his arc quieter. He is tested by the gang, by grief, by violence, by poverty, by revenge, and by the chance to disappear into bitterness. Again and again, he bends but does not break in the same way others do. This preserved integrity is why he becomes such a trusted companion in the epilogue. By 1907, the world has changed, but Charles's basic moral shape remains recognisable. He is harder, perhaps more tired, but not corrupted. He can still help build, he can still fight when necessary, he can still leave when the time comes. He has not been frozen in innocence. He has survived without becoming hollow. The word survivor fits Charles, but it is not enough. Micah survives for years too, and his survival is rotten. Dutch survives, but as a ghost of himself. Bill and Javier survive into worse futures. Charles survives differently. He survives with enough soul left to choose peace when a path appears. That is rare in Red Dead Redemption. Many characters live physically while losing themselves morally. Charles fights hard not to let that happen. In the end, Charles Smith stands as one of the purest counters to the Linde gang's collapse. Dutch says he loves freedom, but becomes controlling. Micah says the strong survive, but proves strength without conscience is ugly. Arthur says he is a bad man, but learns to do good at the end. John says he wants to change, but struggles to leave violence behind. Charles says less than all of them, and by saying less, often shows more. Here's what strength looks like when it does not need applause. And now, as the fire settles lower, Charles can be held in the mind as a whole life rather than a side character. The child of a black father and native mother, the boy who lost his mother to soldiers, the runaway who learned to survive alone, the hunter who respected what he killed, the new gang member who never fully surrendered his judgment, the friend who helped Arthur see more clearly, the protector who stood with the Wapiti, the mourner who buried the dead, the fighter in Saint Denis, the builder at Beecher's Hope, the companion on Mount Hagen, and the man who finally turned north. Let the night hold him gently. Let the bison move across open grass without waste. Let the bough rest beside the fire. Let Arthur's grave sit quiet on the hill, tended by memory. Let the boards of Beecher's Hope stand warm under John's hands because Charles helped raise them. Let the road north stretch ahead through cold trees and clean air. Charles Smith does not need a grand speech to be remembered. His life speaks in the things he does carefully, and in Red Dead Redemption 2, careful goodness is rare enough to feel almost sacred.